The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Welcome to the show. Today, risk mitigation for utility scale solar projects. My guest today is Kimberlee Centera, the CEO and founder of TerraPro Solutions. Welcome to the show, Kimberlee.
Thank you, Tim. I'm really excited to be here.
I need to give Patrick Brown a shout out at Baywa Re. He was so kind to introduce us, and I'm so excited to learn more about what you do. We've obviously had a couple of conversations, but there's so much to learn about this subject. So thank you for coming on the show and making time for us. Tell our audience, how did you get interested in renewable energy and start TerraPro Solutions?
Right. Interesting question. Well, I actually was looking for a legal position, and there happened to be one for a small wind energy developer based here in San Diego, where I live. So it was kind of an industry that I fell into. I really didn't know that it existed. But I very soon discovered that it brought together all the things that were really important to me. Working with people, being able to develop projects. I had no idea what it was like to have the opportunity to build something. And back in those days, we were building our own projects. So it was really an opportunity to be able to work with people. I spent a lot of time walking the land with people, in Wyoming and Oregon and Washington and Texas and California. And so I had a chance to hear the concerns of a lot of the people, just the homegrown part of the country. And so being able to bring in renewables and being able to, bring in a wind project or a solar project really did so much for the communities. And I was always really happy and to be a part of that contribution.
So tell us, what is it exactly that you do?
We are a risk mitigation firm that really specializes in real estate and title. And what we help our clients do is understand the scope of their projects. We're looking at our work from a project perspective. So we're a little different than some of maybe the land firms that may do acquisition, because we're focusing on the project as a whole. And we want our clients to understand all the different issues. And we specialize in financing. So we're always preparing our clients for the imminent financing that we know will come up. But we're really specializing in helping de-risk the projects and really helping our clients to understand where those potential issues may exist that could prohibit them from being able to move forward with a financing, construction, and that type of thing.
Yeah, and I would imagine that there are probably half a dozen things that are related to this, but could you drill down on that a little bit? You say risk mitigation. What is included in that?
Well, can be, something as simple as, you're sitting across the kitchen table from a landowner and you're signing a lease and they say, oh yeah, I own the property. And then you go back and you look at title and you realize that really, the title of the property is held in other parties. We've had cases where, we've had 3 and 4 probates on a piece of property. And so, when you look at projects, we always start with site control. Site control is fundamental to these projects. And, from lender scrutiny, everything that we do is built on that basis. So that's our building block, and having that site control. So understanding from a title perspective. But I think also, we look at stakeholders, having worked in many jurisdictions for many years, and realizing the importance of building that alliance. The difference between going in and talking to people and, sitting across a table and building that sense of involvement can be huge. Also looking at environmental, understanding, from a permitting side, understanding all the different issues. So I think really taking that step back and looking at the totality of, the project, not just the land, but, the totality of what's encompassed in this potential project in order to be able to move it forward.
Wonderful. So you mentioned that you work with developers, and that's how I know you. But what other types of clients do you have?
Well, I would say developers predominantly, but we certainly work with banks, and we work with other stakeholders, title companies, Alta survey companies, investors that are looking to understand the extent of the risk. One thing about renewables is the risk perspective is so different, depending upon the timing of the project. And so understanding that, so we work with a lot of the different parties, but I think predominantly it's developers. In some cases, it's banks or investors that want to understand, the commercial risks. What are we facing here? And we try to always understand, if I'm looking at a project, I always start out with preliminary questions like, where is it? City and county and that kind of thing. How many megawatts? What is our goal? What are our milestones? When do we want to start construction? When will we be at COD? Those kinds of things to be able to help guide. And that, and in a lot of terms, will define the risk. So most of the times when parties do come to us, they want us to help them understand, what are they looking at here? Every project is shovel ready. That's, gets sold out in the renewable space. So helping to understand, what does that really mean? What are we really facing? So that's really, so it can be banks, investors, it can be various different parties that want to understand what they're facing in terms of a project.
And I would imagine that there are some unique risks affiliated with utility scale. First of all, how do you define utility scale, and if you're a solar developer, at what scale do you need a TerraPro Solutions?
Right. That's a good question. I mean, we talk to some folks, and, a lot of it depends on the business model and the risk of the project. In a lot of cases, the smaller projects, let's call it, maybe 5 megawatts or less, the risk perspective is different. The investment is different. But on the utility scale, when you start to talk about, 200 million, 300 million, or more, then you have quite a substantial investment. And so, it can be driven by a lot of different things. Even the smaller projects sometimes are put together in portfolios. But I mean, I think, probably 25 megawatts and above is kind of what I think of as utility scale. But it can also be defined by the risk, by how it's structured. The deal structure can also affect, how it's viewed in terms of utility scale.
Sure. And does the risk profile of, let's just say you have a 100 megawatt project. We see a lot of that here in the Midwest now. 100 to 300 seems to be the sweet spot. Does the risk profile vary a lot from region to region? Are things different here in the Midwest than they are in Texas and they are in California?
Absolutely. I mean, it really depends. And when I'm talking to someone, it's really an important question. Understanding where the project is. I mean, just, if you're in Kern County, California, you're going to have certain issues, you're going to have certain challenges versus if you're in Colorado or if you're in New Mexico. We have a project right now that is facing a multi-million-dollar issue as a result of some severed mineral rights. And so, yes, it very much depends on the jurisdiction that you might be working in, and what kinds of things you might want to be looking for. If you're in Colorado, in some cases on the permitting, they have on solar projects and wind projects, they have given standing to the mineral holders in certain cases where they require you to go out on a solar project and obtain surface waivers as part of your permitting. And to me, that can be daunting, if you put that much leverage in the hands of, a third party like that, it can be very difficult. So really important to understand those, as we're going in to a certain area, understanding those nuances. Sometimes it's nuances that you really need to be aware of.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that, here in the Midwest, so much of it is a greenfield. Most landowners have not seen ground mounted solar in their backyard. In 10 years, it'll be a common thing and attitudes will change, but there is still a fair amount of NIMBYism going on. Um, but tell us, what is the ideal development stage for you to get involved in a project?
I do a lot of talking around risk mitigation, and one of the most important things that we can have on our side, and I actually speak on negotiations too, and I feel like time is such a huge leverage for us. And so what I like to help my clients understand is, if we have a client looking to acquire a portfolio of projects, we like to work with them at the earliest stage to have them understand all the different issues. What are we facing? Because in my view, if you want to be able to make smart decisions, it has to be on the basis of what because what you don't know is what's going to get you. So you want to understand all those different issues. We did some due diligence for one client on some title, and we found we had a break in the chain for vesting, which means that we were not going to be able to substantiate the ownership. And we were going to have to go back and get a new patent issued. And then we were going to also have to do a quiet title action. And so the costs were going to be, a couple $100,000. It was going to take, over 2 years. 2 to 3 years maybe to get all that resolved. Well, that's where, you want to make an informed decision, right? And so you may say, well, this is not going to be developed, for 5 years. We've got plenty of time. The returns are going to be great. We're indifferent to that, or it's a risk that we're willing to take. Or you may look at it and say, nope, this project is slated for, it's got to be in the ground in 2 years. That's not going to work. So the most important thing, I think, is getting involved early so that we can work with our clients to help them understand all these issues. Doesn't mean you start all the work early, but it means that you know what you're facing, you know what you need, who you need to talk to and what you need to resolve.
So let's dig a little deeper there. What is included in front end due diligence and risk assessment?
We are usually always, like I said, site control is a foundation piece of these projects. And then we have the idea of perfected site control. And so site control initially would be, looking at your, looking at your agreements, have you got the right people signed? Do you have the land that you think that you have? Looking at the title, starting to look, even working with surveyors and, identifying the landscape of the property. Ultimately, we know that we have to get this, insured from title insurance. It'll have to pass due diligence. So kind of looking at the totality, what are the things that we might be facing? We do a lot of work with our clients on title insurance. It's really changed. The whole title insurance landscape has changed. And, we follow a lot of these different pieces. And so having our clients understand, what they might be facing, there's huge costs around some of this, in a state like Texas, a 250 megawatt project can cost you almost $1 million for title insurance. So you need to really understand early on, what some of these issues are. I mean, especially with solar, solar is different from wind in that with solar, we're covering the entirety of the property. So some of the mitigations that we use for wind, hey, we can all get along. There's plenty of land. Turbines are really spaced out. It doesn't work in solar. Solar, we're going to take all the property. So when we're looking at anything that's going to affect that property, any third party rights, we need to understand all of that, because if we run into issues, down the road, and we have to start, changing our design, all of a sudden we lose, huge pieces of property because there's some issue, there's a conservation easement, there's, something that's come up that we weren't aware of that will cause us to have to, move to another piece of property. So it can be a challenge.
Yeah, that reminds me of the Sydney project. It's called Prairie Solar here in Champaign County. It's a 1,200-acre solar farm that is in development, not in construction yet. And, they got feedback from the village that the village really wanted to earmark some of that ground for future development. And luckily, Baywa had the flexibility, with your assistance, I think, to relocate a significant portion of the project further east. And, but that's no small potatoes. Um,
No, it's not. And our counties and our local jurisdictions, they're not always sympathetic. I worked on a solar project in Imperial County where we were hardwired on our design. Basically, it was done. And we were working with the county because as part of our permitting process, they were requiring that the project dedicate certain portions of the road for public use. And we see this sometimes with counties. They use the leverage of the permitting process to get some of these things done that, maybe they wouldn't have ordinarily get done. And I remember having a call because they wanted us to extend out by, a total of 80 feet. So 40 additional feet on either side of the right of way. And I had the map out and we were talking about it. And I said, look, this is our project boundary. This is where the panels are. We don't have another 80 feet that we can give you to be able to meet that, this extended right of way that they wanted. So we ended up in, discussions around how do we work this out to be able to get them what they wanted. And eventually we were able to do that and the dedications were completed. But even something as simple as a dedication, which oftentimes are agreed to through the permitting process, and everyone kind of thinks, oh, it's not a big deal, we'll just dedicate wherever we need to. But when you start to look at the parameters of the project, what's available, how much land you have, what you're even, permitted to do, you may not even own, or your landowner may not even own the property to be able to do that. So it can be something as simple as a dedication that you end up, spending a lot of time trying to work out with the agencies.
for sure. I want to remind our audience, we have a healthy group on here, that you can put questions in the Q&A, and both Kimberlee and I can see those. I will be happy to cue Kimberlee with the questions, but this is a great opportunity to interact directly with a very seasoned um, developer here. So please engage. Um, let's talk a little more about the stages of due diligence. Can you walk us through that?
Right. Typically you have kind of the what I think of as the pre-development phase. And that's a lot of times when you're, doing your initial due diligence, acquiring you're tying up the land, entering into the contracts. You're trying to get the boundaries of your project solidified. And so, as I mentioned in those early stages, we're really looking at that site control and trying to understand our site control. And then we move into what we call pre-construction, which is also kind of a anticipation of some kind of financing for construction. And at that point, we become focused on, NTP, notice to proceed. When are we going to be kicking off the contractor? Because typically that will trigger a lot of really important, together with our financing that's going to be triggered by that. Our construction contractor is going to want to know, what is the design? Where are we? Do we have all the rights? Do we understand all the, the title insurance, all the Alta survey? Have we looked at everything? Everything goes into that Alta survey so that our design, can be, carried through. And then we come into our financing, and then we go, and that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of getting all of the due diligence together, and we have a protocol that we like to follow. We have certain checklists we like to use. We like to have kickoff calls. We like to work very closely and engage with our parties and make sure that they're educated and they understand our project, which really helps to mitigate costs. And everyone is working from the same sheet of music, as they say, in terms of the project. And then we go through construction. And sometimes we're involved in that in terms of just making sure that, what the plan was, how things get constructed, is what actually happens. Ideally, there needs to be conversations during that period of time. Things change in construction. A lot of times what looked like it's going to work perfectly, has to be changed. And so we need to make sure that we're communicating about those changes. And then we go into operations. And a lot of what we do, we've created a lot of schedules and a lot of pieces that we like to say that travel with the project, because I've worked on operations. And, it's one thing to be on the front end and negotiate all these leases, but it's another thing to be on the back end and be the one that has to actually execute on them and comply. And so having good tools and making sure that all that information gets passed on through, all the way to the back end of the project for the ops is really super important.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we've already identified a couple of stakeholders in these utility scale projects. You, of course, have the landowners, you have local jurisdictions, including the county, perhaps towns and villages or cities. Perhaps the state is influential, certainly around environmental. You have the state EPA. What other stakeholders are you working with, and how do you navigate that and build trust with stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tim, because for us, it's fundamental. Because as I say, these projects go through cycles. And a lot of times when you're working in a jurisdiction, there'll be a momentum. There's a momentum that happens with these projects that just fuels more and more development, like you're seeing in Champaign County right now. And a lot of Illinois is experiencing that momentum. And having been in a situation where I've come in after other people have maybe gone in and kind of burned the bridges a little bit, making sure that those relationships are really open and there's clarity around and transparency, I think, around what's needed, is super important. But I think you mentioned the Prairie Solar project. That was interesting, because we have, a local utility there who is, as we're completing our design, they are widening their transmission easement that happens to run, through several parcels. And so, what was 150, foot easement may all of a sudden be, a 300-foot easement, right? And so when you think about stakeholders, it's easy to overlook, stakeholders like that. So I think it's important to pay attention because, you want to have conversations, with those utilities or some of those other folks that you can maybe overlook. We've had cases where, we have a cemetery, this happens more in the Southeast, but, we have where, the county or the city wants to make sure that there's access. There's certain things that we identify early on that we say, okay, we're going to need to circle back and find out, who our parties are. And then we're going to want to make sure and talk to them. So it can vary from project to project, but it's really something that you want to pay attention to because, again, it can materially affect your design, as in our case with this transmission line that runs through the middle of several of our parcels. And, they're senior to us in time, right? When you think about, the legalese and the financing. So they're not going to go away. And we're not going to go away. We have a permitted project. So we have to figure out a way to work together.
Yeah, that's quite a curveball. Um, I hope the project survives that. Uh,
Oh, it will. I mean, and I think these are things that you encounter, and I think this is why it's so important to look at the totality of the project and really, sit down. We love to sit down really and look and talk about it, because we're not just looking at a series of leases. We're looking at a project. I mean, I've had issues come up around access, and I've had to explain to people this idea that there's physical access, and then there's this idea of insurable access, and they can be two very different things. I've had conversation with people and they're like, Kim, what's the big deal? I can drive from the highway up over to the project and it's not a big deal. And it's like, but it's dirt roads. It's never been dedicated to the county. We're not going to get it insured, so that means that we're not going to be able to have a lender come in and invest in our project. So we have to figure out a way. So as we're looking at this, we want to make sure that we are looking at transmission. We're looking at the point of interconnect. We're looking at the project. Where's all the different pieces? Let's make sure that we're, looking at all of our stakeholders. I mean, I work a lot with, transmission design, and I love the engineers because, it's like point A to point B, it's a straight line, right? But in the real world, we know it doesn't work that way. We know that not everybody, and even in ag, even if a solar project is going in, they don't necessarily want a transmission line running through the middle of their project all the way up to the point of interconnection. So then you have to start deviating, and then you have to start looking at things like, okay, where's the barns? Where's the houses? Where can we redesign this in a way that is, least intrusive? Because again, these are our stakeholders, and we need to be able to work with them. And sometimes they're involved in the project and sometimes they're not. So, taking a look at all those different pieces and making sure that you are understanding it, let's look at the design from a high level first in terms of the project.
yeah, we have a question about de-risking in various stages of project development. And I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but the question is, how much is de-risked prior to having a buyer, in this case, the buyer's counsel, try to earn their keep, and how much is de-risked in the final phase when you're negotiating an exit or a sale? What do you say to that?
Well, here's my view. If I'm sitting in the seat of the seller, I would prefer to know what all the potential issues are, because that way I know what I'm negotiating, right? Because there's nothing worse than sitting there and having due diligence come in and all of a sudden you have 30 pages of issues that were not aware of. A lot of times it becomes a subject of negotiation, and if people have worked on these deals, they know, depending upon who's acquiring the project, some companies will come in and say, nope, we'll take it just like it is, we'll figure it out, we'll solve it. And in other cases, they put the onus on the seller of the project to fix whatever the title issues are. To go, we talked about the difference between site control and perfected site control. And in those cases, the difference can be, have you really looked at the title? Are there any senior liens that we need to be aware of, that we need to address? And then that is kind of the difference. And I've seen cases where that requirement to go out and perfect the site control, that responsibility is put on the seller of the project. So it really becomes, a matter of negotiation. And I find that our clients prefer to know. They would rather have us tell them, here's what we see. And we evaluate risks and we'll say, here's a huge risk and here's a small risk. We did a review project for a company in California, and they had a series of sites that they were trying to prioritize, and they were using different methods. And one of the methods that they used was a title review. So we had one piece of property we looked at for them, pristine title. I mean, perfect, absolutely perfect, except that it was about 20 miles from an interconnection. And then we had another piece of property that we looked at for them. It was, the title was It had all kinds of oil and gas leases. It had a mineral severance held by Chevron. It had a $43 million prior deed of trust. So when I look at something like that and I'm talking to you and I say, okay, there's on this, half section of land, there's a $43 million deed of trust. What that tells me is that that's a pretty valuable piece of ag property that you're dealing with there. And so going in, as you're making decisions, we're going to have to get that deed of trust subordinated. So what are some of the things that we're going to look at? How, what other property is that deed of trust attached to? There's a strategy, because you might go in and say, we're going to take all this property out of ag use and we're going to put a solar farm here. Well, the question from that lender is going to be, well, how am I going to get paid? Right. And this is not even on the project side. This is just on the property side. So, again, these folks didn't want to do anything about it necessarily today, but they wanted to be able to understand the different risks associated with these different sites. So that's kind of an example of how you can look at it from the perspective of, understanding and prioritizing.
Yeah, it seems like it's both a bit of a layer cake that you're digging deeper and deeper. But then there's also a cycle that will inevitably repeat itself during that process. Um, let's talk a little more about your relationship with the developer and stakeholders. I can imagine it could be quite difficult for you to really be as involved as you might want to be. It's up to the developer um, to open the kimono and let you in, isn't it?
That's right. Yes, it varies. And it depends. I mean, sometimes we'll do our review and our due diligence, and our clients will want to undertake some of the work on their own. But I think one of the things that we do, and we're just super proud of the fact that we build an alliance with our clients, and they end up feeling like we're like part of their development team. And we have our clients tell us that, it feels like you all are just part of our team, because we put ourselves in their shoes. And again, the difference between looking at these from a project perspective and just looking at it maybe as a piece of land, here, you got your lease, you're good to go. And so I think as we work with our clients and we really go the step beyond, because these projects feel like our projects. I still feel like I'm a dirt person, I've got, dirt in that's just my thing. And so, but I also take, we all really take an ownership with the clients, and really, try to guide them as best as we can. And we're always going to let our clients know what we know. And if we see issues, obviously it's up to our clients to decide how they want to approach it. But we want to make sure that they're making, informed decisions. What are the best decisions? We have a lot of experience. We see things that come up. I mean, we're working on a storage project right now, a 70 megawatt storage project. And our clients underestimated the importance of the stakeholders, and they were going to be having a hearing, and they thought, well, this hearing ultimately it's decided at the county, it's not decided at the city level, so how important really is this? Well, it was pretty important, because the city was going to be weighing into the county, in terms of deciding how things were going to proceed. And there hadn't been good communication. And so there was a lot of concerns that were raised. And so they came in and they said, look, we need you guys come in, help us, help us manage this, help us work with the relationship, and help everyone else understand, what it is that we're doing here.
I always say solar is a team sport, and the more that everybody can be on the same team, the better. Um, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Tell us a little more about the relationship between yourselves, the developer, um, and lenders and investors, because that can there's quite a power dynamic there, isn't there?
Yes, there absolutely is. And, I've financed a whole lot of projects through many, many years. And there's certain practices that we found that really work and really work well. Certainly, understanding your project and making sure, we found going on the offensive and being proactive. So when we started due diligence, we like to have a call and explain the project, lay the project out, including some of the hairy stuff, and make sure that everyone understands. What I found in my many years of working with counsel for lenders and tax equity is that if you have a good story, if you've taken the time to be thoughtful and put together your information and organize your information in a certain way and present it a certain way and say, look, we have this here, we're working through this, we have this over here, this is our plan. Usually it lays the framework for a whole different, and I would even say a collaborative negotiation. And so if you're having calls, if you're communicating, we have, like I said, checklists that we like to use to be able to communicate the status. Always working with people to try to get the answers, I think is the most important thing. But what I found is just that communication and responsiveness, understanding, undertaking, making sure that you respond to the questions is probably one of the most important things that can be done to bridge that relationship, right? Because we understand the questions, right? When the questions come in, we understand the questions. We know. I have attorneys that tell me that they still set up their due diligence the way that I've set up my due diligence in the past. I like to have everything line up. I like to have it all be clear. And, in the old days when you'd send out boxes of material and, everybody would get it and say, oh my gosh, what is this? So having it well organized, all of that lays the foundation for very collaborative. And the difference in the negotiations is huge.
From my perspective, there are two basic categories of developers. Maybe this is simplifying things too much, but there are those developers that build and flip either pre-NTP or post-NTP, and those that are going to develop and then be long-term owners operators. And that doesn't preclude, of course, a sale down the road. But is that accurate? And what are the differences? And I guess, how do you see that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, in some respects, I agree with you. And I certainly get the idea that, again, there's a spectrum in renewables. And if you're able to go out and get site control and acquire a series of leases, some developers, yes, they're going to get that site control together and then they're going to sell the assets. And then you have others that take it, up to NTP. I mean, obviously it's a value proposition, right? I mean, the further along in some cases that you've developed a project that you're able to demonstrate that, the more valuable it's going to be. But at the same time, there's other entities that, just give us the site control and we'll deal with the rest of it. Because I think a lot of times in the small development shops, they don't really understand, they don't work on the financing side. So some provision that they agree on, that they concede, might seem like a real simple thing for them. It's like, oh, not a big deal, we can work around that. But they may not realize the implications on the financing side. On the basis of my experience, you can get almost anything financed. I mean, through the years with motivated of entities, you can work together. And when I say that, I mean, if you've negotiated in good faith, I've negotiated with water districts where, you know, you go in and you think it's a negotiation. It's not a negotiation. It's basically, you know, here's what we're willing to do. Here's what we're not willing to do. The BLM, state agencies, you know, so you work with what you get. But I think, you know, there's a place, I think, for all these developers. There's absolutely a place for all these developers. I don't have a single client who isn't willing to take a look at a site. You know, they're all interested in taking a look at a site. There's a benefit there. So I think there's absolutely a place for all those different developers in the spectrum of the renewables.
So it sounds like, um, kind of fundamentally, you are functioning as the glue between the developer and and the investors. Do you want to say more about that? That sounds like a good and, critical role, but it also sounds like a fairly complicated waters to navigate.
I think that's right. You know, I've have in my own experience of development and certainly working with the clients, I've seen the benefit of understanding, of structuring your project, of having, you know, all of your lease agreements, of having your title work complete, of understanding, even if you have, we had a project where we had, I mean, I lost count of how many probates we had, where we had to go back and clear title. Even if you have all of that together, and I think that's really where our real benefit is. We know what the lenders want to see. We know what tax equity wants to see. We know how they like to have the material presented. And so by the time we get it into their hands, a lot of times it's very clean. It's all together. It's in a form that everything matches and it makes sense. And so it makes it easier for everyone. Even the banks and the attorneys appreciate the fact of well organized, well thought out, someone that can lead. You know, there's a lot of cases where we're working on a financing and there really isn't a commercial lead. And for me, that's a critical role because I've seen what happens if there isn't someone who's leading and directing the transaction. And that can be our role, whether we're on point with our client or we're just helping our client behind the scenes. We want to help them be prepared and looking at all these different issues. Again, looking at the totality of the project. What do we have? You know, the four corners of the project, looking at the point of interconnection, transmission, access, all of our, you know, where the improvements are going to go. And it really makes for a much smoother transaction. And I think that's probably one of the greatest benefits that we can bring to the table in terms of the developers and the banks.
When you say commercial lead, though, what is it that you mean?
So what I've seen is there needs to be someone on the developer side who understands the transaction and is leading the transaction through, is making the decisions, is pushing the transaction through. Because if you don't manage these transactions, then, you know, they take on a life of their own. And so it's really important to have someone on the developer side that is managing the transaction. Usually you're managing to a closing date. And the benefit of having everything packaged and having it all together and being able to sit down and have a call and explain your project and say, look, this is the deadline when we want to close by. Here's all the things that we've done. Here's all of our, you know, perfected site control, our pro forma, our Alta survey. You know, I mean, we get involved in looking at the financing agreement and some other reps and warranties, all the different documentation, making sure that that's all together. I mean, even something as simple as never typing a legal description, you know, more than once because little mistakes happen and, you know, so, but I think that's really a huge benefit. The other area that I think besides the financing is also the early stage, you know, what we call fatal flaw review or due diligence. Because even the smaller developers or the smaller shops, there can be a benefit to them to understand where the potential issues are. They can choose to fix them or not, but at least they have the benefit of knowing here's where we could have some potential gotchas that, we may want to be aware of.
Indeed. We're going to wrap in about 10 minutes, so please get your questions in. We've got a few audience questions that we can take right now. And Doug asks, how important is the environmental due diligence on these larger utility scale sites, and how do you address those as a company?
Environmental is critical, and taking a look at it. We don't typically do environmental review, but understanding it is crucial, right? I mean, looking at those different layers, and depending upon the jurisdiction that you're in, there's going to be different concerns. But absolutely, I mean, it's very important. You want to make sure that you look at it, and there can be implications that can ripple throughout, the whole project. And
It's Yeah, it's always a little shocking to me how AHJs view these developments, because oftentimes we're dealing with land that is farm ground here in the Midwest, certainly, right? And and so you would think, look, this land is already pretty heavily impacted. Farming is quite an industrial practice in the modern world, but they pretty much lay fresh eyes on it and say, okay, what's going on with stormwater? What's going on with endangered species? And what's going on with the vegetation on the site? And how is that going to change during the development? And so you have to be very proactive and expect the best, but plan for the worst, really. And and that's yeah, you can't be too prepared.
well, and I think the way that we work with the environmental pieces, most of our solar leases are you maybe have an option for all the property, either a separate option or perhaps an option incorporated within your lease. But then there's this ability to designate certain property that you want to incorporate for purposes of the project. And then you're going to have a legal description drawn for that particular property. So one of the ways that we're going to work with the environmental teams is there may be certain areas that we want to avoid. When the environmental work comes back and we start to look at, the design and how it's laying out, we're going to work with the teams to say, okay, if we've got an impact over here for wetlands, or sometimes you've got little home, cemeteries, or, you've got areas where, especially on ag, you may have, areas that you want to avoid because maybe there's some contamination or what have you, and you just don't want to have to, do all the reclamation. So we will work with the teams on the design in order to take all those different things into account. But as you start to craft those legal descriptions, we talked about the Ameren transmission line, as you're crafting your legal descriptions, you've got to make sure that you've got access, right? You don't want to create a legal description for yourself and all of a sudden, you've got property to the north and property on the south, a transmission line in between, and you don't have a way to get up to your property on the north. So looking at all those, becomes a function of taking into account all the different inputs, which would include the environmental.
Another question about title insurance. Can you speak to what title insurance costs are in other places? You, I think, referred to Texas. The listener estimates $4 a megawatt from your comment. Do title insurance costs vary much around the country?
They do. They do. It varies a lot. It really depends upon the state in which your project is located and whether or not there's an ability to negotiate. California, you have more of an option to negotiate a lot of times on title coverage. Some states are promulgated, some states are statutory, it just depends. So as part of that conversation, if we're going to help our clients place a project with a certain carrier, we want to have that conversation. We're going to say, look, there's going to be a financing, there's going to be a transaction in June of next year. We're going to want an owner's policy and a lender's policy. We're going to need these coverages. And we want to make sure that we're going to be able to get those coverages, what's the cost going to look like, and what are your requirements going to be? Because again, it's something that becomes, it's something people don't really think about until the last minute. And all of a sudden they have some really difficult requirements that they have to try to tackle at the last minute to try to close on a transaction. We worked on a project where in order to get our mechanics lien coverage for our lender, which was a requirement, first lien, always for the lenders, we had to go out and get 40 additional documents just days prior to our closing. There was a series of subordinations and different documents that were going to be required. So, we can assemble a team, we get that going, we get it done so that we can close on the transaction.
In the few minutes we have left, Kimberlee, what do you say to developers? There's a spectrum, of course, in terms of their capabilities, their experience level. And, you've worked with some of the best developers like Engie, who we've had a wonderful experience with, but it's not like that all the time. And, but what do you see as an industry? Solar is still a very nascent industry. We have a lot to learn, even though the technology is mature. As an industry, it is still fairly new, but very fast growing. And so you have this confluence of events, really. What what would you like developers to know more and do better with?
It's a great question. This is not an easy business to succeed in. It's a tough business, and I've been around for a long time, and I've seen the cycles, and you've got to really persevere through a lot of really tough stuff. And every time we close a project, it's great. It's because you can always debrief and say, okay, what did we learn this time? So we're ready for the next one. I think really realizing the power of relationships and stakeholders. And then also, you really need to know what you're facing. That would be my strongest recommendation for developers. Find those good partners, find those stakeholders that are going to align with you in terms of helping you to really understand your project and what it is that you're bringing to the market. Because I think it's a way for us to really, capture the most value. And this is all about value. It's all about the money, really. It's all about being able to close on the financing, close on the deal. And so I think really making sure you've got, good stakeholders and you've got that help, early on to really understand your projects and be willing to reach out and ask for that help, I think is super important, especially early, because time is a powerful leverage. If there's one thing that is most helpful for us, it's not having a closing, tomorrow, and having the benefit of that time to be able to position ourselves so we can really, maximize our projects.
So in the final minutes here, let's talk a little more about the future. Where do you see the opportunities in solar development, and what is your vision for the future of your work?
I think solar is really poised to really just even explode, more than it has. And I think, we're seeing changes in wind as well, but I think solar is a great opportunity for a lot of people to, the best part about these renewable projects is it really makes a difference for a lot of the people who might otherwise not be able to benefit from this. And it has a real benefit to just the local communities seeing all those advantages. So I think for the future, one of the things I would love to see is better policy, because I think there's so much, so many, it's so hard to predict, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, what you're going to be facing. So I think if there was more consistency, if certain things were more predictable, I think that would really help us a lot. And I would love to see that be part of the future, in order to be able to foster renewables. Like you said, that the NIMBY, we still, even now, there's a lot of opposition. And so I feel like and I don't really feel like it's authentic. So I think having that policy would really help us across the board, would really help us to be able to succeed sometimes where it's very difficult. And what are you trying to subscribe to? Is it the city? Is it the county? Is it the state? I think that's going to be very important. I think solar is going to continue to be a huge resource, and I'm really excited to be a part of it.
It is a very exciting industry. I feel very blessed to have the opportunity to be here right now. It's a great time. Well, thank you so much, Kimberlee Centera of TerraPro Solutions. How can our viewers and listeners find you?
Our website, www.terraprosolutions.com. You can reach out. There's a place where you can email, and you'll hear from us. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
And you will hear back. Kimberlee has a wonderfully organized staff. So I want to thank all of them for setting this up and making this happen. It was just a fantastic experience. So thank you all.
Thank you, Tim.
And thanks to all our listeners. Let's grow solar and storage. Have a great day, everybody. And thank you again, Kimberlee.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.